How many of you have been so stressed out that you couldn't form the words? You couldn't talk about what was going on for you. You couldn't even respond to the person who was asking questions. And we see this a lot when it comes to relationships, when one person is being attacked, or in the workplace where you're being pulled up by a boss, or even in academia when we have handed in a project too late, or we're really running late on the deadlines. We may not feel like we've got the words to discuss what's going on. Now, there's a real reason for this. During the stress response, the brain is so heightened that the part of the brain that's responsible for speech production, and this is the part in the left hemisphere, if you dig a little bit deeper into the back of the frontal cortex, you've got something called Broca's area. Now, Broca's area is the part that's most active when we talk. So when I'm talking to you right now, when you're listening to me and then you share this information to somebody else, that part of the brain is so active. And some of us might have watched Netflix's The Irishman, the Robert De Niro character, just after he's killed the Al Pacino character. Now, I forget the names of these particular characters. He's trying to talk with the wife of the person who's just killed, and he's mumbling, stumbling, can't bring up the words. This is a really common response when it comes to threat and stress. Now, why am I talking about this when we've just covered the stress response in a bit more detail? We've covered the fight and the flight response, and now we're jumping into the freeze, fall, and the fawn responses. Well, it's all part of this particular concoction of stressful stimulus. What does this even mean? Well, within the freezing response, we have an experience where from the top of our head to the tip of our toes, we feel frozen like a deer in the headlights. We're not quite sure what to do. And if we're sitting down, we might just feel like we're all tense up and can't produce the words. There's so much going on in the brain that, it'd be boring to go through all the nitty gritty of the human stress response in terms of the neurobiology of it all, but I will dig a little bit into it because from a very instinctive point of view, the body is trying to camouflage itself when it's freezing up. And it does this really well in the wild. After all, most of our evolutionary history has been developed in the wild, where if a predator is coming closer and closer to us, we can camouflage into our surroundings. Some animals do that a lot better than others. You can see it in the sea with different octopuses and octopi rather, and you can also see it in the land with lions and tigers and different types of prey animals which can be really, really well camouflaged. You can see it with insects as well, with various moth varieties and stick insects that just camouflage into their surroundings. And whenever they are triggered, they stop and then they try to blend in. Humans do this too, albeit we're a little less convincing when it comes to blending into our surroundings when we're in the middle of stress. Of course, we can stop and try to hide behind something, but if the stress is staring at you right in the face, then it's really difficult to be able to blend into your surroundings. And so we're kind of stuck for what do we do? Do we fight? Do we fly away? Do we get out of this situation? And these pushing and pulling can really get rid of our basic instinct to escape the stress. So oftentimes when a person freezes in a situation, it's because they have either been in this situation so many times and they haven't been able to get away. You may not have been able to get away from your boss shouting down your throat, or you may not have been able to get away from a partner or a particular deadline that you've asked to extend and it just couldn't do it. And so you're not quite sure how to process that. The freeze response is useful in that it helps in certain situations. It is very unuseful when it is stopping you from getting to where you want to be. And that's what we have when a person freezes up, is the fight and flight happening simultaneously. it kind of borders between the fight, flight, freeze and also the falling down response. The freeze response has the sympathetic nervous system as well as the parasympathetic nervous system in high gear. Now, your nervous system consists of your brain, your spinal cord, and the nerves that protrude from the spinal cord and enter the entirety of your body. The central nervous system is your brain and the spinal cord, like that highway between your body and your head, and that central executive, that part of the body that controls everything else. That's your central nervous system. Now, your peripheral nervous system is further broken down into your somatic nervous system and your autonomic nervous system. And your autonomic nervous system initiates the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Okay, so what does that look like? The sympathetic nervous system is that part that initiates your body into these responses to keep you safe. That fight, flight, freeze response. Then that kind of arrest and orient response, which is kind of considering where this stress is coming from. That's your sympathetic nervous system. It's the same system that's available when you're running to catch the bus. It's the same system that's going on when your heart's racing the first time you get out of bed when the alarm's gone off. It's the same part of your nervous system that is available when you're running a race. I mean, it's not a bad thing when this part of the nervous system is acting. The parasympathetic nervous system, you can consider a parachute. A parachute, it helps calm you down, helps bring you back to the ground, onto safety. And the parasympathetic nervous system is the part that calms your body down. It's that rest and digest system. So to consider the sympathetic nervous system and then the parasympathetic nervous system, you consider that these two work in tandem, and when one's over-functioning and one's under-functioning, you either get stressed out too much and with little ability to calm yourself down, or you're just always calm and nothing stresses you out. So depending on what your experiences are and what your biological makeup is, this can lead into different day-to-day responses. All right, so let's go back to the freeze response. The freeze response peters between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system in the way of talking about kind of being geared up to fight or run away, but not being able to do so. And there's kind of like a misfiring that happens within the freeze response. And this brings us to the fall response, because the fall response is if you're not able to get away from the stress by tackling it head on, by getting out of that situation, by making yourself invisible, then your body automatically tends to just give in. And the way this looks like is kind of like a slouching in the shoulders, a head gone down. You might feel demotivated or lethargic. You might just nod and agree, or you might actually just faint. I mean, some people get to the point where they are so stressed and that nothing works that their body automatically crawls up into the fetal position and they faint, or they just stay in that position, not being able to move, just to preserve energy. And there is some utility to all these systems, the fight, flight, freeze, fall systems, in terms of preserving energy. Especially with the fall response, your body wants to preserve its energy. And how it preserves its energy? Well, what it does is it slows down the heart. It initiates a cooling down response. Another thing it does, it can slow down your breathing rate to save energy. It can slow down digestion. It can even pump the body full of endorphins just in case you were hurt and you don't feel these sorts of things. Sometimes people have these responses where they're attacked and they just don't feel it until after the situation. I mean, there are so many stories of people in the midst of a situation being almost mortally wounded, but they're unable to feel the hurt until after it's happened. One guy was attacked by a tiger at one point, and his body went into limp mode, and he could not feel anything that the tiger was doing, but he was aware that he was awake. It was only until after the tiger let him go and he was scared off, the tiger was scared off by other people, that he started to feel these responses. In my own experience, I remember when I was a kid, I was walking down a park and an adult was playing tennis with a barbecue cleaner that had the blade on it, and it was hitting the tennis ball, around, and the blade flew off, and it cut me right onto my elbow. I had no idea what happened. I felt like there was something that kind of tinged me, and when I looked down, I saw that it was completely white. The meat was cut open, and it was slowly building with blood. Now, I didn't feel it, but the sight of it made me scream, and it was only after, when I was applying pressure to it and I was being tended to, that those sensations started to come. The body is ingenious when it comes to delivering on its protective features. And so that brings us to the final response that I've been able to identify, the final F in the 5 Fs, which is the fawn response. Now, the fawn response is kind of a variation of the fawn response, but it's also a truly human response, I consider. It's when a person is trying to appease the stressor. It's trying to kind of say, hey, okay, I agree with what you're saying, and trying to do anything it can to get itself out of that situation. An example of that would be a person who is coming towards you, and you try to throw them a compliment when you're feeling actually pretty scared of them. That compliment to that potential threat throws that person off, and it's kind of like, oh, cool. And then that initiates discussion. There are clients that I've seen that have been robbed, and joking around with the person that's robbing you actually got the robber to give the possessions back. These sorts of responses, the fawn response, bring about an intense sense of shame and guilt after it's happened. In the middle of the situation, hey, it's going pretty well because you're keeping yourself safe. But towards the end, you feel incredibly stressed out. And oftentimes this happens to people who are highly agreeable, people who are going to say yes sir, no sir, and who throughout their life have been doing that and tend to agree more than people who are very disagreeable. Now, that's not to say that any of these are negative. They're physical responses that happen in the human body to save you from a threat, a stressor. Now, how these relate and distinguish themselves from anxiety are two different things. The fight, flight, freeze, fall, fawn responses, although they have their utility, they can be a bit destructive. And how they differentiate between themselves, that stress response, and anxiety, and further to trauma, that's what we're going to be talking about in the next class.